Those of you who followed me for a long time know how rare it is for me to dedicate an entire video to a single mystery, but this case is so bizarre, so cryptic, so downright interesting that I wanted to go really in depth with it. Brian Shaffer was a guy who seemingly had it all. A great family, an active social life, a girlfriend who thought the world of him, and a very promising future in medicine. Then, one day, in 2006, that promising future disappeared, along with Brian himself. During a night out with a close friend, the young academic vanished from the face of the earth in a manner that's left everyone scratching their heads for the past 15 years. The investigation into his disappearance led detectives down a deep rabbit hole of unanswered questions. Trust me when I say that this is a strange one. So join me as we try to answer this one question. What happened to Brian Shaffer? Back in 2006, Brian was a 27-year-old med student in his second year of study at Ohio State University. It was there that he met his girlfriend, fellow second-year med student Alexis Wagner. The pair fell deeply in love, and Alexis was under the impression that Brian was planning to propose to her that very year, most likely in April during a vacation they had planned to Miami. Sadly, it was also during that year that tragedy struck the Shaffer family. In March, Brian's mother, Renee, passed away from myodysplasia. Brian and his mum were extremely close, and the loss of her hit him like a ton of bricks. Still, on the outside, he appeared to be handling things well, according to his friends at least, and he continued to speak excitedly about his upcoming trip to Miami. There was nothing Brian enjoyed more than getting away somewhere tropical. Everyone who knew him would tell you that Brian enjoyed that laid-back lifestyle that such places embodied, and that even though he was pursuing a career in medicine of all things, his real passion was music. He often spoke about his dream of becoming a musician and living the easy life. He'd once written on his MySpace page, "This whole doctor thing is really just a job, only temporary, until I get my band together and put a record out." March 31st, 2006 was a Friday. It was also the start of spring break. Now, March had been a particularly hard month for young Brian. Not only had the poor guy lost his mother, but he'd been pulling all-nighters cramming for exams. Even though his trip to Florida with Alexis was only 3 days away, the dawn of spring break seemed like a cause for early celebration. That evening, Brian met up with his father, Randy, for a steak dinner. Despite being obviously exhausted, Brian told his old man that he had plans to meet up with a friend later that night. That friend was Clint Florence. He and Brian were former roommates, and the pair were reportedly close. Randy suggested that Brian take things easy, maybe catch an early night. Brian objected. After the month that he'd just had, he needed a boys' night out. At 9 PM, Brian and Clint met up at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a quintessential college bar in the Arena district of Columbus. And yes, that is how us Brits pronounce tuna. No comments down below, please. Brian's girlfriend Alexis was in Toledo, visiting her parents before their big trip to Miami. He called her at around 10 to wish her good night. They exchanged I love yous and hung up. According to her, he sounded completely normal on the phone. Little could Alexis have realized that that was the last time she would ever speak to her boyfriend. Brian and Clint went bar hopping all around town that night, visiting 7 bars in total. Clint would later tell detectives that they'd taken a shot at every location before arriving in Columbus's short north. It was there that the duo became a trio as they met up with Clint's friend, Meredith Reed. The 3 musketeers made their way back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon for one last round. They arrived around 1:15 AM. 45 minutes later, when the bar was closing, Clint and Meredith realized that Brian had gone off somewhere. They both tried calling him several times, but he didn't pick up. They waited outside the bar for him, and when he didn't come out with the rest of the crowd, they assumed he had already gone home to his apartment just a couple of blocks away. But he hadn't. Brian's girlfriend and father tried calling him constantly during that weekend, but he never answered the phone. When he missed his flight to Miami on Monday, April 3rd, they reported him missing. Randy was really starting to worry at this point. The guy had just lost his wife. Had he now lost his son too? Sergeant John Hurst, a father himself, understood Randy's worries, and he and his team of investigators got to work right away. Now, usually in these types of cases, there's at least a clear reason why the person disappeared, or where they might have disappeared to. That wasn't the case with Brian. The detectives weren't even sure whether he'd gone missing on his own accord, or if someone else was responsible. So they started from the most logical place, the beginning, and checked the CCTV cameras both inside and outside the Gateway Film Centre, the building the Ugly Tuna Saloon was located in. Since that area wasn't the nicest part of town, there were surveillance cameras aplenty. Surprisingly, however, the footage generated more questions than answers. As expected, at 1:15 AM, Brian was caught on CCTV riding the escalator to the second floor with Clint and Meredith and entering the bar. Shortly after, both Brian and Clint were again recorded standing just outside the bar, flirting with two women, Brighton Zatko and Amber Ruick. Brian even reportedly kissed Brighton on the neck. At 1:57 AM, the cameras again showed him standing just outside the bar, again with Brighton, who put her number into Brian's phone. She headed back into the bar to use the bathroom. When she returned, Brian was gone. The footage appeared to show him turn and re-enter the bar shortly after Brighton went to use the bathroom. Those are his last known movements. You see, the cameras never showed Brian leaving the bar. A few minutes later at 2 AM when the bar closed, the cameras captured the flood of people leaving the tuna, heading down the escalators and out of the building. Investigators identified everyone who left the bar that night, and Brian was definitely not amongst them. Footage from all of the outside street cameras were also checked, but there was still no trace of the guy. Brighton and Amber were tracked down and cleared of any involvement. Dozens of officers searched night and day for Brian. All of the local hospitals and shelters were checked. The sewers were scoured. Sniffer dogs were brought in to track his scent. Posters were put up everywhere, and a hefty award was announced. Possible sightings of him in Texas, Michigan, even as far as Sweden were investigated and discounted. Doors were knocked on, questions were asked, but no one seemed to know anything. After he disappeared, Brian's apartment was burgled. This brought fresh hope to the case. Surely this burglary was connected to Brian's vanishing. It wasn't, and turned out just to be a coincidence. Brian's favourite music group was Pearl Jam, and frontman Eddie Vedder took some time off during a concert to mention the case and appeal for any leads. Nobody came forward with information. Desperate for answers, Brian's father Randy paid a psychic to help find his son, and was told that his body was somewhere in the Olentangy River. Randy thoroughly searched that river, and almost lost his own life in a whirlpool, but ultimately found no trace of his boy. Brian's girlfriend Alexis called his mobile every night, but her calls never went through. Except for one night, that is, several months after he had disappeared, when it actually rang a few times before disconnecting. Brian's phone company later said that it could have been a cellular glitch. His phone also pinged in Hilliard, just 14 miles from where he went missing. Another glitch, or evidence of something more sinister? Since Brian disappeared in 2006, his phone has never been used to make a call, and his credit card hasn't been used to make a single purchase. As bad a sign as that is, to this day, his whereabouts and well-being remain unknown. We'll start with the obvious theory. Brian met with foul play. Either he said the wrong thing to the wrong guy at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, or looked at the wrong guy's girlfriend the wrong way, or went down the wrong street at the wrong time on his way home. Sure, things like that happen all the time. But none of the other customers that night noticed Brian getting into an argument with anyone, and the guy didn't exactly have any enemies to speak of, so if there was somebody waiting to jump him, it was most likely a stranger. Some people believe that Brian's friend Clint was somehow responsible for his disappearance, or at least know some details about it, because even though he told his side of the story to the authorities, to this day, he still refuses to take a lie detector test. Personally, I don't think that's suspicious. Contrary to popular belief, lie detector tests are seriously unreliable, and are just as likely to get an innocent man into trouble as they are to take him out of it. Clint's lawyer likely advised him not to take the test. A sound decision, and certainly not indicative of him being guilty of Brian's possible death. That doesn't mean that someone didn't kill him, of course, but the main problem with this theory are those CCTV cameras. The areas outside both the bar and the Gateway Film Centre building in general were covered, and they didn't capture Brian leaving the premises. Where would the perp have jumped him? Where would they have hidden his body? So if there's no videotape of him leaving the bar, then Brian's still inside the Ugly Tuna Saloon, right? As crazy as it sounds, some people believe that Brian somehow died in the bar that night after all the other customers had left, likely in the bathroom. Terrified of a lawsuit, the bar owner and his staff switched off the security cameras both inside and outside the establishment, tampered with the footage which had already been recorded, and hid Brian's body either under the floorboards or within the walls. That would explain why he was never captured on tape leaving the bar, but it completely falls apart when you hear that investigators searched the Ugly Tuna Saloon from top to bottom and didn't find any trace of Brian inside whatsoever. What about if they switched off the cameras outside the building as well, snuck him out, and disposed of his remains elsewhere? Well, that theory's still pretty hard to believe. Not only would the owner have had to convince his underpaid staff to go along with his plan, they'd also have to somehow get their hands on the CCTV footage of all of the surrounding businesses. Though technically not impossible, that seems extremely improbable. Still, since there's still no explanation for how young Mr. Shaffer left the building that night, wild theories like this are bound to crop up. Speaking of wild, one of the darkest and most controversial theories is that Brian fell victim to the Smiley Face Killers, aka the SFK. Between the late 1990s and early 2010s, a surprisingly large number of young, well-educated, college-aged men were found dead in bodies of water across several Midwestern states. We're talking hundreds of men. At least 45 of these were determined to be the work of either one or multiple killers, and more than 200 others are still being looked into. Almost all of these slain men were athletic, popular, and successful college students, and almost all of them were targeted on their way home after spending a night on the town. It's been theorized that all of these slayings were the work of one well-organized, nationwide group called the Smiley Face Killers, who targeted, quote-unquote, privileged men. In at least a dozen of these cases, a smiley face was found graffitied at the spots where the bodies had been dumped. It's said that the SFK communicate through the dark web to select their targets. Brian was 6'2", athletically built, highly intelligent, and from a privileged background. Exactly the type of guy that the SFK targeted. With that in mind, it's easy to see why many internet sleuths link the SFK to Brian's disappearance. Still, it's never been conclusively proven that the SFK are a real group. Smiley faces are a very common thing for people to graffiti. Just walk through your city and count how many times you bump into one. It's possible that their presence at all these spots was just a coincidence. With no further evidence to prove that the purported SFK were somehow involved in Brian's disappearance, or that they even exist, this theory lacks weight. Regardless, it's a possibility I had to share. So we know that Brian wasn't caught on camera leaving the bar. We're also sure that he isn't still inside there somewhere, and that the staff didn't tamper with the video footage. That must mean that he vanished in the small space between the building's exit and the outside area that the cameras covered, the so-called dead zone outside the camera's view. Well, as you can see, that dead zone was only a step or two. There was nowhere for him to disappear to. Nowhere, that is, but down. Just outside the Ugly Tuna Saloon was a service exit that led to a construction site. On that site, workers had dug a big hole. It would have been extremely difficult for Brian to leave via that exit without being detected, but crucially, not impossible. If he stayed close to the wall, he could have snuck past the camera's field of view. The whole theory then suggests that Brian, for whatever reason, stumbled out that exit, wandered into the construction site, and fell into the hole. He either died or was knocked out from the fall, or, unable to escape and at the end of a heavy night, simply fell asleep. The next morning, the construction workers failed to spot Brian inside the hole and covered him in cement. Perhaps Brian's been much closer to home all this time than anyone could have imagined. Sadly, this theory too has its flaws, since according to the construction workers at the site, if Brian had fell into the hole, it would have been impossible for them to have missed him. So, unless the building team just so happened to all be opportunistic killers, we're right back where we started. Then again, people, even multiple people, can sometimes make mistakes. To me, this seems like the most plausible theory so far. Finally, with no body and no suspects to speak of, is it possible that Brian didn't meet with a grisly fate at all, and that he actually went missing on his own accord? In my opinion, the running away and starting a new life elsewhere explanation rarely turns out to be realistic. I mean, people have been searching for Brian for the past 15 years, and despite having a lot of defining features and his case becoming quite prolific, the guy still hasn't been found. On top of that, setting up a new identity and starting your life from scratch is no easy thing to do, especially for a guy in Brian's position. He wasn't exactly a man with nothing to lose. It doesn't make much sense that Brian would randomly decide to throw away his relationships and career prospects. But what if it wasn't a random decision? Like I said at the beginning of this video, as intelligent and academically gifted as Brian was, he always longed for a simple life. A relaxed life. The life of a musician. Maybe he'd gotten burned out from his years of study. Maybe the prospect of becoming a doctor, or the long hours, intense workload and stress, had him dreaming of a way out. With his girlfriend expecting a ring and all the responsibilities that come with it, the realities of his upcoming future may not have aligned with his expectations. I think we all know that feeling to some degree, that our lives are planned out for us way too early, and oftentimes that plan isn't plan A. Sometimes that plan is somebody else's altogether, and in our heart of hearts, we want nothing to do with it. Could it be possible that Brian was secretly having those kind of thoughts? Could it be possible that he was planning on escaping the life he was leading without telling a soul? It may have just been a fantasy that he was playing within his mind until the loss of his mother, which could have pushed him over the edge. Indeed, Renee's death likely affected Brian's mental state a lot more than people realized, and it's easy to see how that could have been the emotional catalyst that finally made him decide to shed his identity altogether and change the path he was walking down in life. His once crazy fantasy may have not seemed so crazy anymore. As compelling as that all sounds, this theory still fails to answer that one nagging question. How did Brian manage to get out of the building without being caught on CCTV? Some people have pointed out that he could have somehow disguised himself and kept his head down, but neither his friend Clint nor anyone that he met that night said that he was carrying a spare change of clothes. That's definitely the sort of thing you'd notice and comment on. One of the detectives on the case also told the Columbus Monthly that they were 100% certain Brian hadn't left through the main entrance in disguise. Given that Brian had been putting in heaps of effort up until that point, cramming for his exams, his decision to leave and never come back was likely made in the spur of the moment. Without thorough planning, it's hard to see how he could have left undetected. Wouldn't he have just, left via the front door with everyone else and walked off into the night? And I do mean walk, since if he did decide to leave, he didn't take his car with him. It was found still parked outside his apartment. Would he have really left something so useful and expensive behind? Personally, I don't think I buy this one. In fact, I don't really buy any of these theories. That's what makes this case so bizarre. Nothing really seems to add up. So, where does this all leave us? Unfortunately, in a place without any answers. Even if the truth does one day bubble to the surface though, Brian's father Randy will never get the closure he so desperately craved. He died back in 2008 while clearing debris from his yard. A sudden windstorm caused a branch to break off a nearby tree. It was caught by the wind and hit Randy in the head. The next morning, his neighbors found his body. There was an online condolence book where his friends and loved ones left him goodbye messages. One of these messages read, "To Dad, love, Brian, US Virgin Islands." Finally, there was a development, and Brian's brother and last surviving family member, Derek, had renewed hope that his long-lost big bro was still alive. Sadly, this message turned out to be a callous hoax, posted by some anonymous degenerate from a computer in a public library. Shortly after, an anonymous tip was made, claiming that Brian's remains could be found in a field just outside of Columbus. Sniffer dogs combed all of the fields on the city's outskirts. They found nothing. Just another cruel joke. Many that were close to Brian are sure that he's dead, his body hidden away somewhere in the city. They say that, if he truly were alive, he would have returned home after the loss of his father. There's no way he would have allowed his younger brother Derek to go through life without a family member by his side. Derek himself still remains hopeful that his brother is alive somewhere though, and believes that Brian's friend Clint may know more than he's letting on. In Derek's words, "I've always thought Clint definitely knows something, just won't come forward with it. If Brian did take off somewhere, if that is the case, we just always had a strong feeling that Clint would possibly know that." Brian's former girlfriend Alexis also believes that Clint might be holding back information, though she herself remains certain that Brian is no longer alive, saying that he would never abandon her and his family. As previously mentioned, a lot of suspicion has fallen on Clint due to him refusing to take a lie detector test. Though I don't blame him for that, it's entirely possible that he is holding back some information. The pair were close, and it's possible that Brian confided in him, told him about his plan to vanish that very night, and made him swear to never tell a soul. Still, that's just speculation. Then again, speculating's all we can really do at this point. It's honestly quite remarkable how little evidence there is to work with in this case. How one man can so thoroughly disappear from the face of the earth is anyone's guess. The biggest question of them all is how he exited the bar without being caught on camera. Without that first piece of the puzzle to work with, it's basically impossible to fill in the rest of the picture. But what do you think? Is one of the theories I covered correct? Does Clint really know more than he's letting on? Is Brian alive or not? In either case, where is he now? Let me know your thoughts down below, and if there are ever any new developments, I'll be sure to update you. Until then, the only thing we can be sure of is that someone knows something, even if that someone is actually just Brian himself. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. A huge thank you to all of my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters. Sullen Nightmare, Madam Dark Carnie, Hamish Kay, Amanda Hanson, Phantom Knight, Expand On, The Lecky, Leonardo Martinez, Ricky Cohen Jr., TheOnlyDorita, Lord 210, Azrael Warakai, Infamous-senpapi, Connor Louthan, Nadine, Sloan Crawford, Sarah Ramirez, Anime Wim, Charlie Lackey, Gina Valera, Procupidine Natter, Philip Westra, Alex Greensall, Tom King, Monica Mendoza, and Crawford K. McDonald. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. It really helps the channel out. If you haven't already, then be sure to smash that like button or I'll smash you, and you'll be hearing from me again very soon. Until then, you all stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.